CEO hears intern, comforting crying customer in sign language. The restaurant gleamed like a promise kept: two long marble floors, golden light, silence pretending to be elegance. Even the air felt rehearsed, as if warmth had been polished away to make room for efficiency. From the far corner, the CEO stood in plain clothes, a gray shirt and cap masking what power once meant. He had come to observe quietly, but what he found instead was a mirror of everything he feared: perfection without pulse. At a table near the window, a deaf customer sat, trembling fingers shaping words the world refused to see. The staff shifted uneasily, eyes sliding past discomfort. Then the intern stepped forward. Her hands moved with a grace unlearned, weaving calm out of air. The guests' tears slowed, then stilled. The scene was small, silent, and seismic. In that stillness, the CEO realized how loud his success had become. The marble shone like truth stripped of heart. That night he made his choice to vanish into his own empire, to listen where no one else had bothered to hear. What would you do if you were in Harlan's shoes? Tell us below. Your story matters. The name tag read Hal Rowe. It hung crooked on the gray fabric of his shirt, as though the lie resisted settling in. The uniform smelled faintly of detergent, and anonymity, pressed simple, meant to erase whoever wore it. Kara walked him through procedures with the numb rhythm of habit, her tone as neutral as the walls. "Follow the chart. Don't improvise," Dustin whispered to another waiter, grinning. "New guys slow already." Harlan said nothing. He just adjusted his grip on the tray, cataloging tone, posture, and every small cruelty disguised as routine. The bar shimmered under artificial light, rows of crystal glasses like trophies of obedience. But in the storage room behind it, dust clung to forgotten boxes, and the air felt heavier, stale. Dean passed through immaculate as his cologne, offering praise without attention. His compliments never reached his eyes. At the corner station, Elena folded napkins, every crease perfect, her quietness forming its own kind of resistance. On the wall above her, a KPI chart blinked: shorter service times, higher satisfaction. The numbers glittered like currency. Beneath them, Harlan saw only emptiness shaped like a heart. He wrote a single line in his notebook: flawless but soulless. The mask was on. The infiltration had begun. Schedules thinned like breath in winter. Breaks shortened, pauses vanished, and conversation became a luxury too costly to afford. A printed sign above the lockers read, "No unnecessary talk during shifts." Words had been reclassified as waste. Harlan carried trays through aisles of synchronized smiles, each grin a reflex, not a feeling. The precision was surgical, the humanity anesthetized. When a VIP entered, the floor transformed. The rhythm sharpened glasses, lifted chairs, aligned voices, dipped into scripted warmth. Everything moved perfectly, like gears polished to silence. Harlan watched the seamless choreography unfold, understanding that perfection here was a form of blindness. Dean sent an email later that evening praising Kara for exemplary leadership. The compliment went to the entire staff, CC'd for effect. The same hour, Elena's shift was quietly reduced. No explanation. She didn't protest. Instead, she spent her break before the mirror, signing each menu item into memory, her reflection her only witness. Her fingers trembled, once, then steadied. Harlan watched from the doorway, the glow from the hall spilling across her face. The light caught the curve of determination in her expression, a silent defiance against the machinery she worked in. He wrote again, "This company rewards spectacle, not sincerity." The thought felt like an indictment, one that would not fade. The dining floor gleamed under silver light, each surface polished into compliance. Dustin entertained a table of guests, laughter rehearsed his smile, bright as chrome. Behind him, a murmur slipped through his teeth, mocking Elena's gestures. She waves her hands like she's casting spells. The laughter that followed was small but sharp. At the register, Kara split a bill with mathematical grace precision, sharp enough to cut through empathy. Her eyes brushed past Elena without contact, as if she were an object, not a presence. Harlan noted it all silently, the microaggressions, the glances that didn't land. Every detail mattered. Dean passed by and declared, "Professional atmosphere today." His reflection in the mirrored wall stared back a man rehearsed into virtue features fixed in permanent approval. In the reflection, the team smiled, identical and hollow. Back in the kitchen, Elena practiced new menu signs, lips forming silent syllables. The movement of her hands was steady, but her wrists trembled faintly red from long hours. Still, her eyes held calm. Strength disguised as grace. Harlan opened his notebook, drew one deliberate line beneath the last, masks everywhere. Around him, the air smelled of lemon polish and performance. He looked up at the wall of mirrors, saw his own reflection among theirs, and felt the chill of recognition he was part of it now. The afternoon light slanted across the marble, catching the slow movement of Elena's fingers as she guided an elderly guest through the menu. Each gesture was deliberate, soft, patient, the kind of motion that stitched silence into meaning. Her hands shaped words where sound had failed, a quiet bridge over the gap of indifference. The guest leaned forward, eyes following every sign, a nod, a faint smile, then calm. The meal unfolded slowly, a rhythm foreign to the tempo of the restaurant. Dean passed behind them, glancing at his watch as if compassion had a time limit. His lips curved slightly, the gesture thin, almost mechanical. Harlan stood a few tables away, watching. For the first time, something in the sterile light of the restaurant felt almost human. The cold illumination that flattened faces now seemed to soften around her hands. On the far wall hung a framed photo, "Human First." The ink had faded. The corners curled a ghost of a motto no one remembered. Harlan stared at it a long while. The light from the chandelier reflected off the glass, slicing through the word "human" until only "first" remained visible. He took out his notebook and wrote, "The motto is dead." The elderly guest left a note on the napkin before leaving two simple words written in unsteady cursive, "Thank you." Elena found it during cleanup and smiled without sound. Harlan saw that too. One small act quietly done had exposed how large the absence of kindness had become. The floor gleamed like frozen water, every tile polished to mirror perfection. Yet, near the back corner, Harlan noticed a faint fracture thin as a hairline, visible only if one stooped low. It was the kind of flaw most people would never see. He crouched, picking up a napkin someone had dropped, and felt the chill of air seeping through the crack. Dust clung to his fingers, the residue of something neglected. He straightened eyes, tracing the seamless surface around it. Everything here was built to hide imperfection. Dean strode by, perfume crisp, smile professional. "Don't waste time on small things," he said, glancing at the spotless tables. To him, details only mattered when visible. A moment later, Kara logged cleanliness excellent on her checklist. The crack didn't exist, at least not in her form. Elena, at another table, adjusted a napkin holder for a deaf guest, aligning it with quiet precision. Her care, too, wasn't measurable. No form, no checkbox, no KPI column accounted for decency. She moved on unnoticed. Harlan looked again at the broken tile, the minute flaw holding more truth than the polished floor surrounding it. "What isn't on the form will die," he wrote in his notebook. He imagined the crack widening, slowly splitting the surface from beneath, invisible until too late. Later, when Dean congratulated the team for record turnover rates, applause filled the air, a hollow echo against the flawless tiles. The floor shone, hiding its weakness well. Harlan knew better. Systems didn't collapse from failure. They rotted quietly beneath their own perfection. Dinner service moved like clockwork, every motion rehearsed, every sound subdued. The restaurant sparkled knives and glasses, catching light like choreography. Guests smiled, staff smiled back. It was the illusion of harmony, mechanical and complete. Dustin performed at his table, laughter practiced, gestures smooth. When the check came, tips stacked thick as validation. Elena, meanwhile, attended a complex order from a deaf couple. Her hands moved with patience, tracing invisible syllables through the air. The rhythm of her fingers slowed the chaos around her, bending time into something human. But before she could finish, Dean appeared sharp and composed, a flick of his wrist dismissal disguised as control. "Handle it later," his eyes said. The interruption sliced through the moment like glass. The guests' smiles dimmed. Elena stepped back, her expression steady, though her shoulders dropped an inch. The flow resumed, the machine reclaiming its speed. Harlan watched from the corridor, the whole scene unfolding in polished silence. He saw how efficiency could suffocate empathy, how perfection could erase the person it served. In the kitchen, a dish came out wrong. Dean didn't ask who it was for. He sent it back without a glance, commanding another plate, another cycle. The meal continued flawlessly for the wrong guest. Harlan wrote one quiet line: "Flawless service for the wrong person." The phrase felt heavy, like judgment etched in marble. The dining floor shimmered again, a monument to everything beautiful and dead. Somewhere between precision and humanity, the company had chosen its god and lost its soul. The HR office looked less like a workspace than a shrine. Every wall was covered in graphs, curves ascending neatly, metrics glowing under white fluorescent light. Success had been turned into architecture. Dean stood before the charts, back straight, smile practiced. The numbers reflected in his glasses like constellations of self-congratulation. Harlan asked softly, "How are people doing?" Dean didn't look away from the wall. "Turnover's down, 12%, he replied. "Engagement's trending up." The word people had become data somewhere along the way. Kara, seated beside him, pointed at a chart, customer satisfaction's climbing beautifully. Her voice carried the clean emptiness of precision. No one noticed the absence within the numbers, no metric for gratitude, no value assigned to a deaf guest feeling understood. Behind the glass door, Elena passed by, clutching a folder of handouts she had printed herself. Her shoulders were square, but her steps cautious. Dean caught sight of her and said almost kindly, "Don't make guests uncomfortable with that signing stuff." Harlan turned toward the KPI wall. The laminated surface was cool beneath his fingertips, too smooth to be real. The graphs shimmered like glass between him and the world beyond. He left his hand there for a moment, feeling the cold sink in, then withdrew it. In his notebook he wrote, "A wall stands between human and human." The phrase didn't feel metaphorical, it felt literal. Outside the window, sunlight tried to reach the charts, but only reflected back, just like the company's values, bright, polished, untouchable. By now, the smiles had learned contempt. They didn't sneer outright. They curved, small, sharp, habitual. Elena's name carried an invisible pause when spoken, the kind reserved for someone tolerated but not embraced. She worked quietly, memorizing every dish in sign language, her hands fluent where her voice was not. The more she excelled, the deeper the quiet mockery around her grew. Harlan noticed it in fragments, the quick exchange of looks between Dustin and Kara when Elena entered a room, the way conversations stopped half a beat too late. Dean, always observant when hierarchy was at stake, gave Harlan heavier shifts, framing them as a chance to prove yourself. It was a test, disguised as duty. He accepted each one without complaint. Carrying crates, cleaning spillovers, he absorbed the rhythm of exhaustion the others ignored. It grounded him. From behind his cover, as Hal Rowe, he could feel the pulse of the place, its fatigue, its cruelty, its fear of sincerity. During the cleanup, he tried to speak to Elena, unsure how to cross the space between silence and speech. She looked up and answered with slow, deliberate signs, "You okay?" Her hands moved gently, patient with his confusion. He nodded. Words felt unnecessary. Later that night, when the restaurant emptied, he found a torn receipt on the counter. 2 words written in careful script, "Thank you." He folded it, slipping it into his pocket. It was nothing yet. It meant everything. a human gesture in a world that rewarded efficiency over empathy. In his notebook he wrote, "Alliance born in silence." Around him the hum of refrigeration filled the air steady and cold, but for the first time he didn't mind the chill. He wasn't alone inside it anymore. The storage room was bathed in a cold electric blue that flattened everything into geometry boxes, shelves, walls order. Each carton stood aligned edges, sharp symmetry, immaculate. It was the kind of place that looked perfect but felt hollow. The hum of a ceiling light filled the silence like artificial breathing. Harlan entered seeking inventory records, but what he found instead was a small notebook, half hidden behind a stack of napkins. Its cover was worn soft corners bent. Inside, sketches of hands, each page a fragment of language. Notes scribbled in quick strokes, translations between silence and understanding. On one page, in larger letters, "You're safe here." He stood motionless. The handwriting was Elena's. The phrase wasn't for show. It was a promise, one she must have repeated to herself or to guests who needed words they couldn't hear. Dean appeared suddenly at the doorway, his voice clipped. "Everything in order." Here, Harlan closed the notebook calmly. "Perfect," he said. Dean's eyes lingered suspicious but uninterested. He left without another word. Moments later, Elena entered, startled to find him holding her book. Their eyes met. He placed it back where he found it untouched. She hesitated, then nodded a silent acknowledgement that needed no apology. The blue light washed over her face, tinting her warmth in metallic shades. Harlan leaned against the shelf, watching her gather the notebook. For the first time, the sterile light didn't feel cold. It revealed something alive, resilience, quiet, and steady. He didn't write anything this time. Some truths didn't need translation. The dinner rush moved like a conveyor belt, efficient, mechanical, merciless. Orders blinked across screens. Trays moved in flawless synchronization. Each motion obeyed a rhythm calculated for profit, not presence. The air felt timed. Even breath seemed rationed. A deaf guest stood near the counter, hesitant but hopeful hands raised in tentative motion. The staff flowed around them without collision bodies trained to avoid disruption. Efficiency had evolved past empathy. Elena noticed first. She stepped into the current, her fingers beginning to sign a greeting. Before she could finish, Dean's shadow fell across her. His look was sharp enough to slice through intention. A small tilt of his head, a flick of his wrist control, disguised as calm. "Let the system handle it," he said, voice quiet but final. The words were a closing door. The guest lowered their hands, eyes darting downward. Silence filled the space between order and dismissal. Elena stood frozen for a heartbeat too long, then returned to her station, the machine resuming its rhythm as if nothing had occurred. From behind the service counter, Harlan watched, jaw tight. Every instinct urged him to step forward, but he stopped himself. This was what he had come to see, the system exposing its own design. The guest left with a polite nod that looked like surrender. Plates clattered, the hum resumed, and the restaurant's pulse returned to normal. Harlan wrote quietly in his notebook, "Algorithm perfected empathy, deleted." The handwriting shook slightly, a tremor the system would never measure. The next evening, applause filled the break room, sharp and brief. Dean stood before the staff holding a small silver badge, the star of the shift. For excellence in performance, he declared, pinning it onto Dustin's chest. Cameras flashed. The badge gleamed beneath fluorescent light, flawless and empty. Dustin's grin widened, polished like everything else here. Kara clapped on cue. Someone joked about record tips. The laughter died as soon as the clapping stopped, like a sound rehearsed to end on time. Elena's name wasn't mentioned. Not the right metrics, Kara said matter-of-fact when Harlan asked later. Numbers didn't measure the weight of kindness or the cost of exclusion. At the far wall hung a group photo, slightly crooked frame, tilted just enough to distort balance. Elena stood at its edge, half-shadowed, half-seen. Harlan straightened the frame. The image looked better, but the truth stayed bent. Dean, satisfied, moved on to discuss upcoming targets. Dustin pocketed the badge like a coin of self-worth, glancing toward Elena without meaning to. She didn't look up. Harlan stared at the shiny emblem again. It was the same hollow symbol he'd noted before, a smile plated in chrome, a currency of emptiness. He wrote in his notebook, "The system rewards the wrong virtues." Later, as the staff filed out, the photo caught the light reflecting fragments of faces onto the wall. Balanced now, but still untrue. Harlan lingered in the doorway, realizing the real correction wasn't in alignment, it was in definition. The measure itself was wrong, and until that changed, so would every smile. Table 7 waited again set, but untouched, its surface perfect, its silence deliberate. Whenever a deaf guest made a reservation, the staff quietly reassigned them to a different seat, citing convenience policy or timing. Discrimination had learned to wear efficiency's uniform. Elena, unbothered by instruction, continued to prepare the table anyway. She laid out a warm glass of water, folded an extra napkin, placed a tissue beside it, a ritual of quiet defiance. Each motion was measured not in speed, but in care. Dean passed by, eyes grazing the setup. He didn't comment. Instead, he later wrote inefficiency beside Elena's name on the duty board. The word hung there like a scarlet mark, proof that decency had no place in the system. Harlan joined her, briefly aligning the silverware along a perfect axis. Their reflections met on the polished knife edge, two figures framed by absence. The mirrored wall behind them caught the image of the empty chair, repeating it infinitely like a wound reflected in glass. For a moment, no one spoke. The air between them was clean, fragile, human. Then, without looking up, Elena wrote a line in her notebook before clocking out, "Seat them with dignity." Harlan read it when she left, his throat tightening. Around him, the hum of the restaurant continued, precise and indifferent. He touched the chair once, fingertips against its cold surface. It felt like marble, beautiful, unyielding. In his notebook, he didn't write this time. He just closed it, understanding that the story of this place wasn't in its perfection, it was in its empty seat. The storeroom mirror caught her reflection twice, one real one delayed. Elena stood before it, practicing the alphabet in sign, each letter traced carefully through the still air. Her lips moved soundlessly, her hands speaking a language she was still learning to believe in. Every motion doubled in the mirror, every effort mirrored back as proof of endurance. Harlan watched from behind the half-closed door. He didn't enter. Some moments he knew should remain untouched. The fluorescent light flickered softly, washing her face in a pale blue. Her wrists were red with faint marks, the quiet evidence of long shifts and small sacrifices. Yet her gaze remained steady, clear, almost luminous. Dean's reflection appeared briefly in the glass, passing by like a shadow of disapproval. He paused, frowned, then wrote something in the logbook without a word. After hours misuse. Bureaucracy had found a way to penalize dedication. Harlan's hand clenched, then released. The role he played demanded silence. He was still Hal Rowe, a man without authority pretending to belong among those the system overlooked. But in that silence, something settled inside him. Calculation. He wrote later in his notebook, "If the company has assets, she is its rarest one. Not a line item, not a statistic, an unseen engine of care." He looked once more through the glass before leaving. In the mirror, Elena's hands continued moving, calm and tireless. The reflection spoke louder than speech itself. The measure of value wasn't in what produced results, but in what endured unseen. The deaf guest returned that afternoon, shy smile beneath the restaurant's hum. Elena greeted them with fluent grace. "Happy to see you again." Her hands drew the phrase gently through the air, steady and slow. The guest touched their chest, a gesture of gratitude, older than language. The exchange was brief, but it filled the space with something the charts could never count. Dean, passing by, noted the table's timestamp on his clipboard. "Too long," he muttered, writing it down with surgical neatness. Dustin, overhearing, smirked the quiet laughter of someone proud to serve numbers, not people. Harlan replaced a half-empty water jug on the guest's table. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, almost reverent. For the first time in weeks, he felt the air warm slightly around him. Table 7 no longer looked like an empty seat. It looked like a story mid-sentence. The guest's smile, Elena's calm rhythm, the soft clinking of cutlery, everything in that moment belonged to the kind of success no metric could recognize. Dean's report later called it time deviation. Harlan's notes called it human time. Two different clocks measuring the same event. As the guest left, they pressed a napkin flat on the table before going a small gesture unnoticed by most. Harlan saw it. 3 dots drawn in blue pen, an ellipsis. Not an ending, but a continuation. That night he wrote, "We need a new language, one that measures care, not speed." It wasn't just a sentence. It was the seed of a revolution quietly taking root under polished light. Rain softened the city into reflection. The restaurant's glass facade shimmered with blurred gold, every droplet a slow-moving thought. Inside, the last lights dimmed. Elena stepped out clutching her sign language notes under a thin coat. Her hair was damp at the edges, her movements careful but unhurried. Dean exited just ahead of her umbrella tilted to keep himself dry. He didn't see her, or if he did, he didn't stop. The sound of his shoes on the pavement was measured distant. Harlan followed a few steps behind. Without speaking, he opened his umbrella toward her. She hesitated, then nodded once. They walked side by side across the wet courtyard shoes, touching shallow puddles that reflected the faint amber of the street lamps. No words passed between them. The silence wasn't empty, it was full. Each step sounded like quiet understanding. Elena held the folder closer. Harlan adjusted the umbrella slightly toward her side. The gesture was small, exact, human. At the gate, she handed the umbrella back, a trace of a smile softening her face. The rain continued steady and unbroken, wrapping them in the kind of peace that arrives when both pain and purpose are shared. Harlan watched her disappear into the drizzle, the faint shimmer of her outline merging with the rain. He turned back toward the restaurant, its lights now blurred behind glass. Something had shifted, subtle but irreversible. In his notebook, he didn't write tonight. He simply knew tomorrow wouldn't begin with observation. It would begin with change. By the end of that week, Harlan had filled 2 notebooks pages of quiet revelations drawn from days of pretending. He reviewed the data late at night, misaligned KPIs, half-hearted training sessions, a workplace culture held together by fear and silent bias. Each figure was a bruise disguised as a number. His next page wasn't observation, it was design. New metric empathy retention. Training sign language modules. Table 7 reserved for respect. The handwriting was steady, the ink dark. From his drawer, he took Elena's notebook. The folded corner still marked a page, one word written in large, uneven strokes. Safe. It wasn't a statement. It was an aspiration. An email pinged from Dean reminder, "Please refrain from altering performance standards without authorization." The phrasing was neat, the tone paternal. It might as well have said, "Stay in line." Harlan read it twice, then closed his laptop with deliberate calm. The sound was soft final. His reflection on the screen showed eyes sharpened by resolve. He wasn't angry anymore. The anger had cooled into precision. On a scrap of paper beside the keyboard, he wrote a single line. "Silence has an expiration date." The decision wasn't spoken, but it was already in motion. The quiet phase was over. The storm, carefully measured, was ready to begin. The restaurant pulsed at capacity orders, flying trays, flashing human motion reduced to flawless choreography. The kind of order that looked like control until you noticed what it erased. A young deaf guest stepped through the entrance, scanning for a seat. Elena caught sight of them from across the floor, smiled, raised her hands, and began to sign, "Welcome." Her gestures were clear bright against the mechanical flow. Before the guest could respond, Dean stepped between them. His hand rose, palm outward, sharp, flat, commanding. "We'll handle it," he said, blocking the view like a human wall. His tone was smooth, but his eyes held steel. The guest hesitated, confusion flickering before retreat. The current of customers pushed forward, swallowing the pause. Table 7, always the designated void, was shifted to the end of the queue near the wall where reflections replaced faces. Harlan watched from the service corridor, his heart tightening. Every instinct wanted to shatter the choreography, but he stayed still. This was exposure truth, uncloaked by its own arrogance. Elena stood motionless for 3 beats, then lowered her hands, expression unreadable. She turned back to work her silence louder than protest. Dean exhaled, satisfied the system intact, but Harlan could already sense the crack running beneath the surface, invisible yet widening. Somewhere in the hum of machinery and conversation, warmth fled. Even the air felt clinical, stripped of softness. Harlan wrote one sentence in his pocket notebook. "When empathy threatens efficiency, cruelty calls itself order." And still he waited. The moment hadn't peaked yet, but it was coming. It began with something small, a hand trembling, a glass tipping. Water spread across the polished surface, rippling outward like ink on fine paper. The deaf guest's face tightened in apology they couldn't voice. Elena was there instantly, kneeling, her napkin moving in calm circles. She signed, "It's okay," slowly, eyes steady. The guest's shoulders loosened, though embarrassment lingered like a faint bruise. Across the floor, Kara glanced at the clock. Dustin smirked, whispering something about lost time. Dean's gaze flicked toward the ceiling camera, adjusting his tie. Every motion in him prioritized the recording, not the reality. Harlan, watching from the edge of the dining area, took one step forward, then stopped. Not yet. The line between witness and actor was thinning, but the moment to cross it hadn't arrived. The puddle on the table caught the overhead light, turning silver. Elena wrung the napkin, her wrists trembling from effort. Dean's voice carried low but sharp. "Next time, let guests manage their own accidents. We're not babysitters." No one laughed. No one defended. The air tightened. Elena's eyes flicked upward just for a second to meet Harlan's across the room. The look said everything you see it too. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. The moment passed. Plates moved again. Orders resumed. But something had changed in the gravity of the room. The spill had marked more than linen, it had stained the illusion of perfection. Harlan's note that night was brief. "The glass has tipped. Nothing will balance the same again." By morning, the report was already written. Dean's subject line read, "Process delay, employee error." The attached KPI sheet glowed in neat columns of justification. Table 7 flagged in red, abnormal duration. Within seconds, the company's metrics adjusted, swallowing the incident whole. The system had learned how to metabolize conscience. Dustin added his own note to the chain retraining recommended. The phrase sounded helpful, harmless bureaucratic anesthesia. Kara said nothing, but her silence aligned perfectly with procedure. In this place, silence was a signature. Elena stood before Dean's desk, accepting the printed form. She didn't argue. Her expression stayed calm, eyes, clear voice, unused. But her fingers tightened around the edge of her folded towel until the fabric wrinkled like paper absorbing rain. Dean signed the document with a quick stroke and dismissed her. Routine. Necessary. Efficient. Harlan watched the exchange from a distance. No raised voices, no open cruelty, just the quiet machinery of blame doing its work. He could feel the room's atmosphere thin with resignation, every breath measured to the rhythm of compliance. Later in his notebook he wrote, "Blame is the house currency. Everyone pays, no one profits." The words felt heavy but precise. He knew now what he was truly fighting, a culture that turned punishment into procedure and compassion into inefficiency. The scratch had deepened into a fracture, running through the team's spirit like a crack beneath polished glass. The lunch rush hit its peak motion dense and seamless, every gesture pre-scripted. Amid the blur, the deaf guest from before faltered. Their breathing grew shallow, eyes darting for anchor points that weren't there. Then the body folded slow at first, then sudden. A plate slipped from the table, but no one heard it break. Elena moved instantly, sliding to the guest's side, signing calm, measured phrases. Breathe. You're safe. Her hands shaped the air like a lullaby. Dean was there just as quickly, but for a different reason. Step back, he snapped. You're not certified. His tone was clipped professional, almost bored. Kara hesitated, hand hovering over her phone. Security, she asked. Dean nodded. Dustin, meanwhile, cleared the next table efficiency above empathy. Harlan's voice cut softly through the noise space. Give them room. It wasn't a command, but the calm in it worked. The guests stepped aside, a half-circle forming. The overhead lights, cold and white, washed the scene in sterile calm like a hospital pretending to be a restaurant. Elena's hands hovered above the guests' trembling shoulders, her expression pure focus. Dean crossed his arms, impatient. Seconds stretched long and weightless. Every system that had once seemed perfect was now frozen by something it couldn't compute real human need. Harlan stepped forward, steady quietly directing others to clear pathways. No panic, just breath. The restaurant's rhythm fractured, revealing what had always hidden beneath it: fear, apathy, and now the possibility of grace. Time held its breath. The scene waited for one thing that metrics couldn't measure: touch. The air was still heavy when Elena began to sign again. Her movements were slow, deliberate, her fingers tracing the same phrase again and again. You're safe. The words existed only in air, but their weight was real. The guest's breathing steadied. The panic receded, replaced by something gentler, trust rediscovered through silence. Dean stood, rigid arms folded, jaw tight. His eyes flicked toward the clock, toward the ceiling cameras, anywhere but the moment itself. The KPI dashboard would later show a dip in efficiency, a minor incident. It wouldn't show this, the grace of two people bridging a void with no sound at all. Harlan stepped closer, no longer hiding. He fetched a clean, warm towel and set it in front of the guest at eye level, not as procedure, but as acknowledgement. The gesture said what systems could not. We see you. A nearby chair scraped softly. Harlan pulled it closer, inviting stability back into the room. The guest nodded faintly, hands trembling less now. Around them, the dining floor fell into a hush so deep it almost felt sacred. Elena lowered her hands, breath leaving her chest in quiet relief. Dean's posture faltered authority, unsure where to stand when kindness had already resolved the crisis. No applause followed, no commendation. The silence itself was the reward, the fragile peace that fills a space once fear has left it. Later, Harlan wrote in his notebook, "Hands built what policies could not." Connection, unmeasured, undefeated. The day's numbers would recover. The charts would rise again. But none of that mattered. A bridge had been built, invisible yet unbreakable, between two souls who refused to move at the speed of indifference. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. Dean called it a quick procedural review. In truth, it was a sentencing dressed in civility. His words moved with the chill precision of an accountant employee failed to follow process under pressure. Temporary reassignment recommended. Kara nodded once, not out of belief, but reflex. Dustin wrote as if documenting weather-detached, exact, immune. The pen scratched across paper the soundless rhythm of bureaucracy manufacturing truth. Elena stood still, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The faint scent of soap clung to her skin, evidence of someone who cleaned what others left behind. She took the printed memo, eyes lowered not in defeat, but in comprehension. Across the table, Harlan's gaze locked on the page. The document gleamed under white light edges, sharp, harmless in appearance, but shaped like a blade. The language was sterile, its cruelty measured in perfect grammar. Behind them, the glass wall reflected three faces, each cold in a different way. Dean's authority polished and hollow, Kara's compliance the frost of habit, Dustin's apathy a sheen over nothing. Elena nodded, once tucked the paper under her arm, and walked out without a word. No one stopped her. The silence that followed wasn't absence, it was complicity. Harlan stayed a moment longer, his pulse steady the calm before a strike. He saw now how morality could be vacuum-sealed, preserved without life. He wrote later in his notebook, "Paper can cut deeper than knives." And this, he knew, was the final cut before revelation. The back alley was quiet, except for the hum of distant traffic. Elena sat on the concrete steps, the light above her door forming a thin, golden beam that stretched across the wet ground. Her hands rested in her lap, moving absently through a single word, "Sorry." But the apology wasn't to anyone. It was to herself. Harlan approached slowly, the crunch of gravel soft beneath his shoes. He stopped a few steps away, enough distance to let dignity breathe. For a while, neither spoke. The silence felt earned. Finally, he asked, "Why stay?" His tone was even almost clinical, but beneath it was the weight of genuine curiosity. Elena looked ahead, not at him, and began to sign. Her hands moved with deliberate grace, because someone has to understand. The words floated between them, visible only through motion, yet heavier than speech. Harlan nodded, once his jaw tightening, not from anger, but from recognition. The simplicity of her answer struck with surgical clarity. She didn't stay for reward or recognition. She stayed because leaving would mean surrendering humanity to numbers. The air carried the faint scent of rain. Light flickered against the puddles near their feet, trembling but constant. When she turned to him, her eyes no longer carried fatigue, they carried purpose. In that gaze, Harlan saw what every policy failed to name: the reason a company deserved to exist. He stood, straightened his cap, and said nothing more. Decisions no longer needed language. By the time he left, his silence had hardened into intent. The reform would begin not with orders, but with reckoning. The office lights stayed on long past midnight. Rows of data blinked across Harlan's monitor columns of precision, flawless in appearance yet hollow at their core. He scrolled through every metric: sales target, service speed, satisfaction rates. Each chart told the same lie in different shapes. Then he noticed the gap and absence disguised as completion. There was no column for returning deaf customers, no metric for comprehension, for comfort, for dignity. It didn't exist. It had never been recorded. He leaned back in his chair, the silence around him thick as dust. Dean's latest company-wide email glowed on screen, full of exclamation marks, record quarter exceptional growth. The tone was triumphant, blind to the rot beneath. Harlan didn't reply. Instead, he pinned the message to his archive, marking it like evidence. He began to map something new, an axis of value measured not by speed or cost, but by connection. Empathy index, he wrote. Time spent understanding. Frequency of return. Wordless gratitude. The numbers didn't yet exist, but he could already see their outline, an inverted version of everything Dean believed in. He looked toward the window. The city outside was still awake, its reflection sharp and cold. In the glass, his own face stared back, half in shadow, half in resolve. This was no longer observation. It was design. The plan forming in his mind wasn't a rebellion of noise, but of silence, the kind that rewrites rules before anyone realizes they've changed. By dawn, the data on his screen looked different. The system hadn't shifted yet, but the man behind it had. And when morning came, the Empire would start counting what it had refused to see. Jonas Pike arrived with the smile of a man already convinced. Regional Supervisor neutral tie clipboard untouched. Dean welcomed him with orchestrated ease, his voice balanced between charm and control. The presentation glowed on the wall, rising profits, seamless metrics, a brand thriving on paper. Harlan stood in the back, silent, watching the choreography unfold. Dean adjusted numbers mid-sentence, smoothing corners, painting failure into success. Jonas nodded without question. The system wasn't lying to him. It was lying for him. The mask fit perfectly. Elena passed behind them carrying a tray for a small family. The child signed thank you. She smiled and returned the gesture. For a second, warmth bloomed a fragment of truth glowing beside the polished illusion. Jonas complimented Dean's team discipline and scribbled an empty note. Dean's grin tightened, practiced. The mask held, but Harlan saw the seam along its jaw where truth pushed to break through. After the meeting, Dean exhaled pride. Jonas left satisfied. Harlan lingered eyes on the projection still flickering across the wall. The numbers moved like shadows pretending to be light. He thought of Elena's hands, of that child's quiet smile, the only honest metric in the room. Remove mask, he wrote in his notebook. Expose the pattern by its perfection. Anger no longer burned. It cooled, hardened. Steel had found its shape. By noon the next day, Dean submitted the final paperwork Elena Ward transfer, pending corporate approval. His cursor blinked beside the line for reason, then froze. He typed workflow inconsistency, an elegant synonym for erasure. Minutes later, a new thread appeared in his inbox, a data request chain from Hal Rowe. Detailed surgical asking for archived KPI records, time-stamped audit trail staff turnover breakdowns. Dean frowned. The questions were too precise, the tone too calm. Kara noticed first. "He knows the system better than he should," she whispered near the break room door. Dustin laughed brittle. "Maybe it's a PR stunt, some empathy project." The words hung awkwardly, not quite a joke. Across the room, Harlan stacked dishes with quiet rhythm, listening without response. His silence, once a disguise, now felt like a weapon. Dean replied to the data request with forced composure. His hands trembled slightly over the keyboard. For the first time, he reread his own reports and found the lies obvious, thin as tracing paper. By evening, Kara's eyes followed Harlan differently, less dismissive, more alert. The hierarchy had shifted without sound. Harlan returned to his corner table, opened his notebook, and drew a single line across the page. Below it, he wrote, "Bridge burned." Let the smoke signal truth. There would be no path back for any of them now, not for Dean, not for the system that built him, and not for the silence that had once protected them all. The war had begun disguised as paperwork. Harlan arrived before dawn. The city still carried the weight of night, the streets empty, the restaurant asleep. On his desk, a folder too thin for how much it contained screenshots, internal emails, KPI mismatches, witness statements, each sheet a fracture waiting to widen. He had already sent meeting invites to Marla Wynn from HR and Theo Granger from Operations. The subject line was plain Policy Integrity Review, 8 horas a.m. No one yet knew what that meant. Across the floor, Table 7 stood reset, clean, untouched patient. Elena wouldn't see it this morning. Dean had given her temporary leave. To him, it was victory. To Harlan, it was the last proof required. He removed his cap and set it on the table beside the file. The gesture was quiet, ceremonial, and unmasking without witnesses. The gray fabric, worn smooth at the brim, looked almost symbolic now, the uniform of anonymity laid to rest. Outside, the first light spilled over the glass facade, soft and colorless. It painted the marble in muted gold, the same surface that once reflected emptiness. This time, it reflected resolve. Harlan took a slow breath. Beneath the calm, his pulse was steady, anchored. By sunrise, the facade would crack. By noon, truth would walk through the same doors that had once shut it out. He closed his notebook and slipped it into his jacket pocket. On its last page, a phrase waited. The silence served its purpose. Now it must end. And with that, the man called Hal Rowe ceased to exist. The conference room gleamed with sterile precision glass walls, leather chairs, white light stretched flat across the table. Dean stood at the front voice, even tracing numbers across the projected graph like an artist convinced by his own illusion. The lines climbed, dipped, then soared again. "Efficiency has stabilized. He said our systems are working." Then the door opened. Not loudly, not abruptly, just a soft interruption that rewrote the air. Harlan stepped in wearing the same gray shirt that had made him invisible for weeks. The cap rested in his hand now, no longer a disguise but an artifact. Marla Wynne from HR looked up, first recognition dawning. Theo Granger straightened in his seat. Jonas Pike's pen froze mid-note. Dean's words stumbled, caught between syllables. His face drained, but his chin lifted out of habit. Sir Harlan set the cap on the polished table. The room fell still. The man everyone had ignored had just become the one everyone answered to. "Continue," Harlan said quietly. "I'd like to see what my company has become." Dean hesitated, forced a smile, resumed with trembling professionalism. The graphs flickered behind him, smooth and empty. Harlan's eyes tracked each line the language of his own empire, now foreign to him. Behind those clean metrics lay faces, Elena's, the guests, the silence that had become their native tongue. For a long moment, no one breathed. The room was no longer a meeting. It was a reckoning, unfolding in white light. The mask had been removed, not torn off, but peeled away by the simple act of truth, standing where fiction once sat. Harlan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke in a cadence sharper than reprimand. Graphs flickered on screen, those same curves Dean had shaped earlier now, overlaid with the missing coordinates, delayed tables unpaid, overtime, reassigned hours, guests excluded by silence. This, Harlan said, tapping the screen is what you call optimization. You measured profit and called it health. You rewarded speed and called it service. But what you optimized was neglect. Dean's jaw tightened. "We followed process," he said. "Every metric proves." "Then your metrics are wrong," Harlan cut in. His tone was surgical, steady cutting only where necessary. Optimizing a flaw isn't efficiency. It's sabotage dressed as order. Jonas straightened in his seat, the rhythm of his breathing changing. Marla's pen moved, faster notes jagged. Theo leaned forward, face set in thought. The hum of the projector filled the silence like static over confession. Images replaced the numbers. Table 7 across different days. Dean's approval email shortening Elena's shifts the draft of her transfer request. One photo after another, each detail a wound reopened. Dean's composure frayed the corners of his practiced calm, unraveling. "You're misinterpreting data," he said, voice dry. Harlan looked at him not with anger, but precision. "No," he said. "You built a kingdom that punishes kindness, and now we're redrawing its map." He closed the file and stepped back. The room was no longer bright. The white light seemed cold, now its purity stripped. In that chill, the illusion of order collapsed. Harlan turned toward the door. "Bring her in." The words carried no ceremony, yet the room seemed to inhale at once. Elena appeared in the doorway, smaller than the space allowed her sign language notebook clutched like a fragile shield. Her eyes didn't search for safety. They looked straight ahead. "Ms. Ward," Harlan said gently, "could you tell them what happened that day?" She didn't speak. Instead, she opened her notebook fingers, brushing the worn spine, then signed slowly, clearly the gestures she had used to calm a panicked guest. Her movements translated what no language could. "You are safe. Stay with me," Harlan narrated quietly as she moved each word, simple, precise, stripped of performance. The guest recovered. Order returned. No metric captured it. But humanity did. Jonas leaned back, his gaze fixed on her hands as though seeing leadership for the first time. Marla stopped writing altogether. Theo's posture softened. Dean stared at the floor, the confidence leaking from him in invisible drips. Elena closed the notebook and looked down at its frayed cover. It bore the faint ink of years of effort, the word safe smudged but still legible. Silence filled the room again, but this time it wasn't the silence of fear, it was reverence. Harlan spoke, last voice quiet as breath. The right people have been invisible too long. Let's start calling them by their names. And for the first time, the room felt human. The silence after the evidence felt heavier than sound. Harlan stood at the head of the table, his reflection faintly doubled in the glass wall behind him, one image fading, another coming into focus. His voice, when it came, was level and final. "The transfer is void," he said, "effective immediately." Dean's posture stiffened, but the words rolled on, clean and cold. Dean Rourke suspended pending full review. No gasps, no arguments, just the quiet sound of consequence landing. Harlan turned the page in his file. A new initiative will begin this quarter. Mandatory sign language communication training for all staff across every branch. His tone didn't rise. It simply carried weight as if engraved into the air. The program will be called The Silent Connection. Ms. Ward will lead it. Jonas nodded once. Marla's pen moved without hesitation. Theo aligned the documents, efficient in purpose. Papers slid across the table, proof of agreement signatures crisp as seals of reform. Dean lowered his gaze. For the first time, he saw his own reflection in the glass. Not heroic, not wronged, simply small. Across the room, the KPI board still glowed rows of numbers lined like bricks. But now, Harlan saw it differently. "Keep the wall," he said quietly. "Just build a door." For the first time, the team looked up at that wall not as a target but as a threshold. Outside, the fluorescent hum softened. It was still cold light, but the chill had cracked. Something rigid had bent, not broken into human shape. The verdict was final, but it also made room for what could begin. The next morning, the dining floor felt lighter, as if space itself had learned to exhale. Harlan stood beside Table 7, the table that had long stood empty out of quiet avoidance. Today, it was redefined. This table, he said to the staff gathered around, is not charity. It's respect. From now on, this will be our dignity table. The phrase lingered soft but irreversible. A small bronze plaque was placed beside the centerpiece, a single graceful sign etched into metal. Welcome. Not a slogan, not a performance, just recognition. The day's checklist had changed too. Under the usual columns, cleaning service time, customer rating, one new line appeared. Details not in the form. It made some laugh softly, others simply nodded, understanding the quiet rebellion in it. The new KPI metric appeared on Dean's old dashboard, understood. It measured no numbers, only the return of those who felt seen. Dustin, hesitant, approached Elena mid-shift. "How do you sign welcome?" he asked. She smiled, guided his hands. The motion was awkward, clumsy, but sincere. Across the floor, Kara caught the moment, her gaze gentler now. Service continued as always, but something invisible had shifted. The air no longer felt weighed by pretense. Every guest seated at Table 7 would feel it without knowing why, the difference between service and understanding. When Harlan passed by that evening, the plaque caught the amber light gleaming without show. The restaurant still sparkled, but this glow had warmth earned, not engineered. A single table had rewritten the rules of the room. They gathered in silence, not summoned, but drawn. The dining hall, once a place of orchestrated performance, now held the gravity of ritual. Harlan stood before them, unadorned. "We serve people," he said quietly, not numbers. Nothing more, just that. Then, one by one, the staff stepped forward. Dustin placed his stopwatch on the table, symbol of speed, mistaken for worth. Kara laid down a laminated KPI sheet, edges frayed from years of blind repetition. Dean's Star of the Shift badge glinted once before settling flat, its shine fading in the light. Each object landed softly, forming a small monument to everything they'd mistaken for excellence. Elena approached last. She placed her sign language notebook not to bury it, but to open it. its pages alive, filled with gestures that had saved something more than a guest the company's conscience. Jonas moved beyond his usual reserve, announced an expanded budget for empathy training. Theo unrolled a timeline for the first company-wide rollout. Kara raised her hand asking to join the inaugural class. Dustin, quiet for once, simply nodded. The act was wordless, but the air thickened with meaning. The polished surfaces reflected no longer perfection, but people. It wasn't repentance. It was rebirth. For the first time, the company's culture was being rewritten not by policy, but by participation. Harlan watched from the edge of the room, the faint hum of conversation returning like music rediscovered. His work wasn't done, but his silence had become language again. And across the table, the discarded symbols no longer looked like loss. They looked like a beginning. The room had emptied, but the air still held the weight of change. Harlan stood by the lobby window, the afternoon light breaking gently across the new plaque now mounted above the reception wall. The silent connection. The letters shimmered softly, not ostentatious, just present as if they had always belonged there. Elena approached quietly, her posture still modest, her hands folded loosely around her worn notebook. Harlan turned his expression lighter now, though the gravity in his eyes remained. "You speak the language this company forgot," he said. "Humanity." She didn't answer with words. Her smile was small, but sure, her fingers moving with practiced grace. "Thank you." The gesture, simple as breath, carried more weight than any speech could. Overhead, the light shifted warmer by a single degree. It wasn't noticeable to most, but Harlan saw it. The sterile white had softened. The reflection on the marble no longer seemed cold. At the far end of the hall, Dean walked toward the exit, his steps quiet. No farewell, no confrontation, just a door closing softly behind him, a sound that marked not defeat, but conclusion. Harlan stayed where he was, eyes tracing the new sign once more. A name could be many things, branding, policy, formality. But sometimes it was a promise. Inside that promise, a new chapter had begun. The silence was no longer absence, it was space for meaning to exist again. The restaurant's windows gleamed as they always had, but now they reflected people, not just silhouettes. The glass that once mirrored isolation now caught gestures, mid-air hands moving in quiet communication, laughter, unmeasured by metrics. Next to the menu hung a small minimal board of sign language basics. "Welcome. Thank you. Safe here." The design was simple, almost invisible, yet elegant enough to blend with marble and gold. Guests read it without needing to be told its story. Harlan visited without notice, dressed as plainly as before. He stood half-hidden behind the indoor plants, watching. Elena was at the front of the room leading a small training circle, new hires, learning the rhythm of expression without sound. Her movements were calm, fluent, unchanged. The staff followed her hands carefully, some hesitating, some smiling as they caught on. What began as corporate reform had become culture woven into the day's natural motion, unforced. Harlan didn't step forward. He didn't need to. The system that had once consumed empathy was now breathing it. The gears had not stopped turning, they had simply found a human tempo. For the first time in years, he felt no need to correct or command. The legacy was functioning on its own, quietly self-sustaining. Through the glass, he saw his reflection merge with theirs, faint equal fading, gently into the warmth of the light. A business that once reflected perfection, now reflected life. By spring, the silent connection had expanded beyond its flagship. Branches adopted the model. Results followed not the loud kind, but the kind that stayed. Rhea Caldwell from Quality Assurance compiled reports, qualitative responses glowing with quiet gratitude. "They see me now," one read. "I feel understood." Elena's training manual spread across departments, thin, unembellished, written in language anyone could grasp. Jonas Pike approved permanent funding. Theo published the 6-month integration plan. The reform no longer needed advocacy, it had structure. Kara volunteered as a mentor for the next wave of recruits. Dustin, once the loudest performer, led guided tours for visitors pausing at Table 7, the spot that had started everything. This, he told them, is where we learn to listen. In HR, new reports showed numbers no one had expected: staff turnover down, customer returns up. But beyond that, there was a subtle shift impossible to chart: posture, tone, trust. Harlan read the quarterly summary at his desk. For once, the data spoke human figures carrying stories rather than demands. He didn't highlight or annotate. He just read and let the silence that followed feel earned. Success no longer needed to shout. It could whisper and still be heard. The company had finally taught its numbers to tell the truth, and that truth was kindness quantified not by gain, but by grace. The deaf guest came back this time with family by their side. The air shifted as soon as they entered, gentle, deliberate, like memory finding its way home. Elena met them near Table 7, her hands moving in quiet rhythm. Welcome back. The guest's companion, eyes already wet, placed a hand on her shoulder, the gesture saying what language couldn't. The table glowed softly under muted light, a single vase holding white flowers, simple, unadorned, alive. Harlan stood a few tables away, fingertips resting on the edge of an empty seat. Close enough to witness, far enough not to intrude. The guest's eyes shimmered as laughter flickered soundlessly between gestures. The meal unfolded slowly, each moment unhurried whole. Around them, the restaurant hummed not with performance, but with peace. What had once broken was quietly repaired. The company's redemption wasn't an apology, it was in the return of someone who finally felt safe to sit again. Elena invited a new employee to serve Table 7. The young woman's hands trembled as she carried the tray, unsure of the signs. From behind, Elena guided her gently, fingers tracing the air, small cues, steady encouragement. The guest smiled, patient, understanding the effort before the words. Across the room, Kara noted a new idea for the greeting procedure: small, human, practical. Dustin mentioned it later in his night shift briefing, not as a rule, but as an example worth repeating. Harlan watched from his corner, quiet hands folded. He didn't step in. He didn't need to. What he had built now moved on its own kindness with its own gravity, a culture that no longer required its maker. The torch had passed silently from one pair of hands to another. In that simple exchange, the system proved it could carry warmth without command. Harlan paused by the glass doors, his reflection dissolving into the amber light. Inside, the staff stood in a small circle, their hands moving in quiet unison. Welcome. No sound yet, every gesture spoke louder than applause. The plaque reading "The Silent Connection" caught the dusk, glowing soft as conviction. Elena looked up, saw him through the reflection, and nodded once. No words followed. Harlan placed his cap back on the gray fabric smooth beneath his fingers and walked away. He understood now, kindness doesn't need to be heard, it only needs to be practiced. That's the kind of legacy that never goes silent.